Hello, this is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is a Malaysian author who's a double Booker Prize nominee. Born in Taipei, he grew up in Kuala Lumpur before moving to Britain to attend university. His first Booker Prize nomination for The Harmony Silk Factory, his debut novel, was followed by a second in 2013 for Five-Star Billionaire. His short fiction work has won an O. Henry Prize and has been published in A Public Space and the landmark Granta 100, amongst others. His latest work, The South, is a coming-of-age novel of what happens when private and public lives collide. A blend of themes including migration, the effects of climate change and the impact of big companies on small countries are interwoven in this novel. It's the first in a quartet of books that form a masterful portrait of a family navigating a period of great change and the lasting effects on the environment around the world. Tash Aw, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Thank you for having me.
It's such an honour to have you here, and your body of work is extraordinary and has really, I think, done a great service to those of us not within Asia, trying to understand, in a way that's not romanticised in any way, what that continent means to the people that live there. And of course, your life is so deeply woven within the fabric of that place, even though you now live here. And I wondered if you could take us back to your grandparents.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, first of all. And before I go back to my grandparents, which is quite, it's a very rich and kind of wonderful story. I would say that I'm always very touched when I hear people say this, because my intention was never to write to explain Asia, to explain Malaysia, to explain the people I live with, that I come from. My aim was simply to record our lives for ourselves. I'm always very touched that our lives and my stories reach out beyond the boundaries. My grandfathers, I think, are, to me, where this story starts. Both of them came to Malaysia, or what was then Malaya, from southern China as very young men. One was only 15 when he came. My grandmothers were born in Malaya from old immigrant Chinese migrant families who had come in the 19th century. My grandfathers were more recent arrivals, which is why, as a kind of a double immigrant myself now, I can really start to relate to their stories. They arrived by boat after very perilous journeys and found themselves by accident, and we can't understand how or why they ended up in the two very remote villages that they ended up in and spent all their lives in. One on either side of the mountain range that splits Malaysia into two, and one on the west and one on the east. And I used to, although I grew up in the city, I grew up in Kuala Lumpur, I was sent to stay with them during school holidays. And so my life is really a story of a split identity between rapidly urbanizing Asia and an Asia which is trapped in a kind of, I guess, a rural existence which is going slowly downhill and hasn't recovered since. It's a tale of two universes, which is why quite often in the South, and I think also in my other novels, there is this duality. There are really two parts of me. The part of me that was involved in the quest for modernity, the quest for education, the quest for culture, and that part of me that was caught in the rural countryside with my cousins, who are still there.
Extraordinary, and still living that life. Well, here you are in London being this famous writer. And I guess one of the ways that changed was because of your parents, your father, an electrical engineer, your mother, a quantity surveyor. How did they move on from that background to where they ended up?
We don't know. I mean, this is why when people talk about hard work being the key to the meritocratic society that we all want to live in, it's not true. I mean, my parents worked very hard all their lives, but so did their siblings. Why does one person manage to make it out of that family? Why does one person manage to make it out of that impoverished rural milieu and get a job in the city? We don't know. Maybe it's a difference in 3 IQ points. Maybe we don't know why. but they were the ones who made it out of their families, and they met. And it was especially exceptional for my mother because she was born in 1942, and I think it's very hard for us to imagine now what it means to be a Chinese woman of that generation, born in a rural community, to have the courage and the wherewithal to make it out of that, to get a place in college in the city. I think that was extraordinary.
And it seems to me, from what you've said in previous interviews and indeed through your work, that your parents and indeed your grandparents really weren't up for discussing any of this.
No, they were just, in survival mode. I was thinking about what their lives, I was trying to recreate the interior landscape of their lives in an earlier work that I wrote, which is a memoir called Strangers on the Pier, that basically made me think about their lives as migrants compared to my life as an immigrant. And I realized that there was no way I could compare the two, because I essentially left my home country for education, and education changes everything. It changes you internally. It changes your relationship with the world, the outside world. It changes the way you speak, the way you think, the way you dress. And they didn't have any of that. So their lives were just about survival. From the very first moment they arrived in Malaya, their lives were only about how are we going to feed ourselves, how are we going to raise a family, how are we going to provide for them till the end of the month. So because they were so consumed with this survival, act of survival, constant act of survival, they didn't have time to speak to us. They didn't have time to speak to my parents. And a lot of their suffering, a lot of the hardship also went undiscussed. And so I grew up with huge swathes of silence in the family. We knew that things weren't right. We knew that things weren't right with some of the members of the family, my uncles and aunts who were suffering from depression, who committed suicide. These things were never talked about. And what I've been trying to do in my work is to excavate some of those deep wells of silence and those deep wells of suffering, because what they wanted our narrative to be as a family was one of success, one of these sort of Asian families who has ridden the kind of the wave of social development, economic development over the last 30 years and gained middle-class jobs and become people like me. And all that has come before they would rather forget. And I find this very poignant because I couldn't have been me without something happening in the past.
And so what was the driving impulse for you to come to Britain and to be a writer? I mean, I don't imagine there was a role model then at home saying, this is what a successful author looks like. No,
I came to Britain for college, to go to university, and there weren't any sort of role models. I'd always been interested in reading. I'd always been interested in literature, but I just didn't see how it could lead to anything. I mean, I didn't go. I'm of that generation of people who didn't have any models. We couldn't look around us to see how one could make a living as a writer. And it wasn't until I started to think about all of my grandparents had passed away when I was at university, and I realized that there was so much that I didn't understand about my family. And coming to Britain really made that clear to me, because people in Britain are so obsessed by genealogy. Everyone is so interested in their own families, even modest families. You have programs like Who Do You Think You Are, where people go back and trace their ancestry. And of course you have the grand families who are so proud and sort of aware of the people from whom they're descended. And I remember I was at university where someone said, someone just made a very casual comment about being surprised that people didn't know the 4 maiden names of their great-grandmothers. And I realized that I didn't even know who my great-grandparents were. These people didn't exist. Never mind the women. I didn't even know the men. I didn't know their names. I didn't know anything about them. And that's when I realized that even my grandparents, with whom I had grown up, I knew next to nothing. I knew very little about my own parents. We were all engaged in this act of, my parents say, we were, engaged in the act of survival. We were engaged in the act of making a living. You were engaged in the act of educating yourself, getting and studying for school. But in fact, what we were doing was engaging in an act of reinvention.
Yes.
That's what we were doing.
Which you continued to do. You studied law. You actually practiced as a lawyer for a while. What then was that impetus to jack it in, to go to UEA and do that fantastic class there and start writing your first book?
I was already writing beforehand, but I needed a job to sustain myself. I needed papers to remain in Britain. I mean, I was comfortable in London then. This was in the mid to late 1990s, and it was a nice place to be. And already, London was expensive, and I had a law degree, so I thought, well, I need to use this, and that was the only way I could think of for staying in the country and continuing with my writing. That those few years, 3.5 years, enabled me to save enough money to then spend a couple of years writing full time. This is a very valuable thing to me. People nowadays tend to think of writing as being this romantic profession, but as Virginia Woolf says, the basic building blocks of writing are often very simple. In a room of one's own, when she talks about having a room of one's own and £500 a year, that's what someone needs to write. I think one mustn't forget the practical realities of what it means to be a writer.
And I love that part of some of the jobs you were doing during that time, you were an auction house porter.
Yes, I did.
And a Chinese language tutor. So when you started writing, what language were you writing in?
I was always writing in English. That was a decision, an aesthetic decision, a political decision I made quite early on. I come from a Chinese-speaking background, but as you probably know, the national language in Malaysia is Malay. But because there are such heavy and divisive racial politics at play in Malaysia, writing in one language or the other would have been seen as quite a controversial political statement to make. And because English was always the language of the book-reading bourgeoisie, basically posh people read in English, spoke in English, and wrote in English. That's what I wanted to be. I wanted to affirm my position in that social milieu and leave behind the more modest one from which I came.
And I wonder then how your relationship with your home country shifted when you were here, and if you felt a sense of otherness here, but possibly one at home too. I mean, you talk about being from this migrant background and not communicating in Malay.
I mean, Malaysia is a very complex country to explain in a short space of time. But essentially, I always felt when I was growing up, at the same time, completely belonging to the country, but also being at a slight remove to it. And I think this wasn't just my fault. I didn't dream up reasons to feel dislocated from the rest of the country. I mean, people told me enough times to go back to China for me to imagine that maybe this was a valid reason for me to be different. And I guess because I got used to that dual sense of, at the same time, completely belonging to this place and being completely familiar to this place, but also feeling slightly out of place, that in a strange sort of way has helped me negotiate being a foreigner in lots of different spaces in London, first of all, and which is, I think, actually a very easy place to be a foreigner. But latterly, in Paris and Berlin.
And, I mean, that wealth of experience, all those different geographical locations must play into your work. I mean, we see that, as you say, but not just a man of two parts, of many.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how this plays into my work. I'm not really aware of it. My work keeps drawing me back to Malaysia. That's, I guess, what is the most important to me. And it's not because of nostalgic reasons. It's not because I'm trying to sort of work through something in my childhood that is unresolved. I mean, that's not the case. Even though I think, one never really gets over, our childhood. It's because the older I get and the more, the further along in my writing career I go, the more I become aware of social and political issues that I really wasn't aware of when I was younger. Because I think when you're living in a particular country, that act of having to survive that I keep referring to, I think that's very strongly ingrained in all of us. You get used to things that are really dysfunctional, political systems that are really dysfunctional, social inequalities that are really obvious and really dysfunctional. And it's not until you leave that space that you can see and you're freed from the need to accept those things as normal, that you see them as being strange and violent sometimes.
So your debut was The Harmony Silk Factory, which of course did incredibly well, particularly for a debut. I mean, just a wonderful way to explode onto the writing scene. It was set in 1940s British Malaya on the brink of the Japanese invasion. It won all sorts of things, the Costa or Whitbread, I think it's called now, Commonwealth Writers' Prize and so on. You then went on, I think it was 4 years later, to do Map of the Invisible World, set in Indonesia this time. And this book, you've written that you're required to detach yourself from the past and live only in the present. Can you explain that to me?
Well, because I wrote that because a lot of my work is concerned with how modern day Southeast Asia thinks of itself and how we have a very complicated relationship with our history and with our recent history, our post-colonial history, which is often steeped in a kind of political and social violence. And I don't mean this just in an emotional sense. I mean this in a real sense. You know, in a country like Indonesia, in 1965, there was a famous coup in which 1 million people were killed. In Malaysia, later on that decade, in 1969, there were Chinese pogroms which led to hundreds of ethnic Chinese people being killed. And you see this being repeated. You see this kind of upheaval in almost every Southeast Asian country, and yet officially now it's not discussed. It's almost in all these countries, these subjects are almost taboo subjects if they're not officially removed from public discourse. And socially, people find it very uncomfortable to talk about it because it means that our lovely history, our lovely current sort of narrative of ourselves, which is one of social advancement, which is one of economic wealth, that's troubled by things that we can't really explain.
Crazy rich Asians is just nonsense.
Absolutely. I mean, that is what we would like to think of ourselves.
Yeah.
I think, and it's not to say that's not true. I think those people do exist, but that's really not the whole story. Rampantly rich Asia is just the modern day cliche of poor, suffering Asia. And the reality is that actually the economic, the rampant capitalism and the rampant economic growth is a papering over of much more uncomfortable, much more complex problems that existed in the 60s and still exist today. And I'm talking about racial divisions, I'm talking about religious divisions, I'm talking about all kinds of social inequalities. The position of women in many countries is still not discussed really openly, as the position of queer people, of migrant workers. These are not subjects that are made publicly available all the time. And part of my project as a writer is to somehow bring these issues back into the sphere of the novel and to write something truthful about our lives, because we live with these issues. We might not be aware of them or conscious of them all the time in Asia, but they do exist.
We talked about you travelling and living in different places, and you went off to Shanghai for a while, and the result of that was 5-Star Billionaire, also long-listed for the Booker Prize. I love the fact it's basically kind of follows a fictional self-help book. Tell us why and how.
Well, because for the longest time, in almost every country I went to in Asia, but particularly in China, in almost every bookstore, the overwhelming number of books consisted of self-help books. And it really was striking to me that these books held such a dominance over the book reading public because it suggested that everyone was trying to improve their lives and that everyone was convinced that they could change their lives quite often just by reading a book. And it really struck me that a country like China that always sees itself as being the polar opposite of America shares one thing with Americans. A lot of the titles I saw were translations of American titles. And that shared attribute is the belief that you can change every element of your life.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess the next book, We the Survivors, is about how you can't.
Absolutely, which I think is, in many ways the reality, because most of contemporary Asia has ridden this wave of euphoria over the last 30 or 40 years, believing that actually money can change everything and everyone can attain that level of social mobility and everyone can attain that level of wealth. But anywhere you go now, you'll see proof that the opposite is true. That in fact, in just 30 or 40 years, we have created a hierarchy that resembles what European hierarchies look like, which is that if you're born into a certain class of family, a certain kind of family, it's just impossible for you to work as hard as you may. You're never going to be able to get out of that.
We the Survivors looks at migration, about people coming from different parts of Asia, as your family did, but it also talks about environmental degradation. I think there's a line in there, the Europeans want to save the fucking planet, so they ban the use of palm oil in food. Within a month, the entire port is on its knees. And I mean, that's something we never think about. Yay, do the right thing for palm oil, not what happens to the workers.
No, absolutely. And it's not even in those cases the plantation owners who are, who suffer, because generally they're part of conglomerates, so they can shift their emphasis somewhere else. It's what happens to the people who are harvesting the palm oil. It's what happens to their families. It's what happens to, their children. And I think when you come from a relatively small country like Malaysia, you're so hyper aware of what goes on outside the country because you feel that, your fate is inextricably linked to other people, other countries more powerful, richer than you are.
You then went on to really your first foray into non-fiction, The Face, Strangers on a Pier. And again, this is a memoir on immigration through the experience of Chinese Malaysian family. This was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and it was done incredibly well. And really just once again taking us back to the themes of feeling alien to your own family.
I think for me, when people ask me nowadays why I became a writer, I think it's because of this very early feeling of alienation from one's own family. And the curious thing is that my family was in collusion with me to create this sense of alienation, because what they wanted for me was for me to read books, was for me to gain an education. But the more I succeeded in gaining what they wanted me to gain, the further I grew from them. And so you have this sense of detachment, which I find, very poignant.
Your new book, The South, lots of big themes there's love, obviously. There's effects of climate change, mostly talking about the West on the rest of the world. Companies like Amazon taking over smaller countries, large companies moving into rural China, that whole sort of the way the world is changing, really. Racism, xenophobia. It's the first of a quartet. So is this written with the idea of the fourth novel already in mind?
It's a very loose quartet. What I wanted to do when I started writing The South was to write a great epic of an immigrant ethnic Chinese family over 70 or 80 years. And then I realized that as a reader these days, I just don't really have the stamina to read 800 pages anymore. And so as a writer, I don't really have the stamina to. And I didn't want to do that. Writing an 800-page epic seems to me to be something really macho and really hyper-masculine. It presumes an understanding of the past. It presumes a top-down understanding of the past, that you're looking back in the past and you've understood everything that your family has lived through, that you have lived through, and you understand every element of history in that time. But in fact, I think we don't experience history like that. I think we live in momentous times. I think we experience history as something more fractured, something more fragmented. And so I wanted to question what it was to write an epic. And it seems to me that an epic nowadays, to be truthful to the form, has to be more fragmented. It has to change, it has to evolve with the times. It has to place people within those moments. And so I came up with the idea of writing 4 smaller novels that look at a small group of people, one family, the Lim family, at various points in their lives at 10 and 15-year intervals. So in fact, although there are the very big themes that you mentioned, which, I really wasn't conscious of as I was writing the novel. I really, when I wrote this novel, I really just wanted it to be a family epic, family story. I wanted it to be a story of love, first love that blossoms between 2 boys.
Which blossoms quite roughly. There's quite a violent sexual encounter right at the beginning of the book.
Yes, I think because we have this idea of what first love is. We have this idea of what your first sexual encounter might be. And very often, it's not what you think it is. Very often, it's awkward. Very often, it's uncomfortable. It's awkward, uncomfortable, and painful. People don't know what they're doing when they're 17 years old. And I wanted to be truthful to how I remembered it to be, and how, latterly speaking to lots of other people, men and women, how they remember their first sexual experiences, which is something that you build up to. You think, oh, this is going to be so wonderful, and you imagine how it's going to be, and then actually the reality is just is the opposite. So really, it sets a scene for a love affair that lasts for a month, a little bit less than a month. Really, it's the end of school year holidays. It feels like European summer, but in fact, it's in Malaysia, it's the end of the year, and these boys meet, and one is from the city and the other is from the countryside. It's where he lives. The Lim family comes from the city to reclaim a failing old, dilapidated farm that is on its knees because of the drought. This is the end of the 1990s, 97, just after the Asian financial crisis, when Southeast Asia was hit by the El Nino weather system, and there were prolonged droughts and no money in the bank. And life looks very uncertain for this family. But all the boys are concerned with, because they're 17 and 19 years old, is falling in love. And their families are kind of breaking up around them. But because they have this really beautiful thing going on, they're not really aware of it. We, I think, as readers, are aware of it. And as a writer, I really didn't want to step out of their world of sort of magic and innocence in a way. But I couldn't help but realize that actually this beautiful thing that they're experiencing is taking place not in a vacuum, but in a very real world where one of their fathers has lost their job. Their mother is having a little breakdown, having existential crises. The other one's father, is in charge of this farm which doesn't make any money, hasn't made any money for a long time. And the whole country is going up in flames. So we don't really know what's going to happen to them. So at the one hand, we want to rejoice at their love together. But on the other hand, I think we're filled with a certain kind of anxiety.
Well, I think you have to leave it there. People need to read this book for themselves, and I'm so glad that it's the first in 4, because it means we've got a lot to look forward to. Tash Aw, thank you so much for speaking to me.
Thank you so much, Georgina.
The South is published by Fourth Estate, and it's out now. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the production team of Steph Chungu and Maisie Ringer. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.